Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuing story of Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights. Last words were, you would watch the operation so intently that Puss's neglect of one ear would put you seriously out of temper. And by the way, please subscribe, please share these videos. Much appreciated. A terribly lazy mood, I should say. On the contrary, a tiresomely active one. It is mine at present, and therefore continue minutely. I perceive that people in these regions acquire over people in towns the value that a spider in a dungeon does over a spider in a cottage to their various occupants, and yet the deepened attraction is not entirely owing to the situation of the onlooker. They do live more in earnest, more in themselves, and less in surface, change, and frivolous external things. I could fancy a love of a life here almost possible, and I was a fixed unbeliever in any love of a year's standing. One state resembles setting a hungry man down to a single dish on which he may concentrate his entire appetite and do it justice. The other, introducing him to a table laid out by French cooks. He can perhaps extract as much enjoyment from the whole, but each part is a mere atom in his regard and remembrance. Oh, here we are, the same as anywhere else. When you get to know us, observed Mrs. Dean, somewhat puzzled at my speech. Excuse me, I responded. You and my good friend are a striking evidence against that assertion. Excepting a few provincialism of slight consequence, you have no marks of the manners which I am habituated to consider as peculiar to your class. I'm sure you have thought a great deal more than the generality of servants think. You have been compelled to cultivate your reflective faculties for want of occasions, for frittering your life away in silly trifles. Mrs. Dean laughed. I certainly esteem myself a steady, reasonable kind of body, she said. Not exactly from living among the hills and seeing one set of faces and one series of actions from year's end to year's end, but I have undergone sharp discipline which has taught me wisdom. And then I have read more than you would fancy, Mr. Lockwood. You could not open a book in this library that I have not looked into and got something out of also, unless it be that range of Greek and Latin and that of French, and those I know one from another. It is as much as you can expect of a poor man's daughter. However, if I am to follow my story in true gossip's fashion, I'd better go on. And instead of leaping 3 years, I will be content to pass to the next summer, the summer of 1778. That is nearly 23 years ago. On the morning of a fine June day, my first bonny little nursling and the last of the ancient Earnshaw stock was born. We were busy with the hay in a faraway field when the girl that usually brought our breakfast came running an hour too soon across the meadow and up the lane, calling me as she ran. Oh, such a grand barn, she panted out. The finest lad that ever breathed. But the doctor says Mrs. must go. He says she's been in a consumption these many months. I heard him tell Mr. Hindley, and now she has nothing to keep her, and she'll be dead before winter. You must come home directly. You're to nurse it, Nellie, to feed it with sugar and milk, and take care of it day and night. I wish I were you, because it will be all yours when there is no missus. But is she very ill? I asked, flinging down my rake and tying my bonnet. Well, I guess she is. She looks bravely, replied the girl, and she talks as if she thought of living to see it grow a man. She's out of her head for joy. It's such a beauty. If I were her, I'm certain I should not die. I should get better at the bare sight of it, in spite of Kenneth. I was fairly mad at him. Dame Archer brought the cherub down to master in the house, and his face just began to light up when the old croaker steps forward and says Earnshaw, it's a blessing your wife has been spared to leave you this son. When she came, I felt convinced we shouldn't keep her long, and now, I must tell you, the winter will probably finish her. Don't take on and fret about it too much, it can't be helped. And besides, you should have known better than to choose such a rush of a lass. And what did the master answer? I inquired. I think he swore, but I didn't mind him. I was straining to see the barn, and she began again to describe it rapturously. I, as zealous as herself, hurried eagerly home to admire on my part, though I was very sad for Hindley's sake. He had room in his heart only for two idols, his wife and himself. He doted on both and adored one, and I couldn't conceive how he would bear the loss. When we got to Wuthering Heights, there he stood at the front door, and as I passed in, I asked, "How was the baby?" "Nearly ready to run out now," he replied, putting on a cheerful smile. "And the mistress?" I ventured to inquire. "The doctor says she's—" "Damn the doctor," he interrupted, reddening. "Francis is quite right. She'll be perfectly well by this time next week. Are you going upstairs? Will you tell her that I'll come? Is she promised not to talk? I left her because she would not hold her tongue. And she must. Tell her Mr. Kenneth says she must be quiet." I delivered this message to Mrs. Earnshaw. She seemed in flighty spirits and replied merrily, "I hardly spoke a word, Ellen, and there he has gone out twice crying. Well, say I, promise I won't speak, but that does not bind me not to laugh at him. Poor soul. Till within a week of her death, that gay heart never failed her, and her husband persisted doggedly, nay, furiously, in affirming her health improved every day. When Kenneth warned him that his medicines were useless at that stage of the malady, and he needed put it to further expense by attending her, he retorted, "I know you need not. She's well. She does not want any more attendance from you. She never was in a consumption. It was the fever, and it's gone. Her pulse is as slow as mine now, and her cheek as cool." He told his wife the same story, and she seemed to believe him. But one night, while leaning on his shoulder in the act of saying she thought she should be able to get up tomorrow morning, a fit of coughing took her, a very slight one. He raised her in his arms. She put her two hands around his neck. Her face changed, and she was dead. As the girl had anticipated, the child Harrington fell wholly into my hands. Mr. Earnshaw, provided he saw him healthy and never heard him cry, was contented as far as regarded him. For himself, he grew desperate. His sorrow was of that kind that will not lament. He neither wept nor prayed. He cursed and defied, execrated God and man, and gave himself up to reckless dissipation. The servants could not bear his tyrannical and evil conduct long. Joseph and I were the only two that would stay. I had not the heart to leave my charge, and besides, I had been his foster sister and excused his behaviour more readily than a stranger would. Joseph remained to hector over tenants and labourers, and because it was his vocation to be where he had plenty of wickedness to reprove. The master's bad ways and bad companions formed a pretty example for Catherine and Heathcliff. His treatment of the latter was enough to make a fiend of a saint. And truly, it appeared as if the lad were possessed of something diabolical at that period. He delighted to witness Hindley degrading himself past redemption, and became daily more notable for savage sulliness and ferocity. I could not half tell what an infernal house we had. The curate dropped to call in, and nobody decent came near us at last, unless Edgar Linton's visit to Miss Cathy might be an exception. At 15, she was the queen of the countryside. She had no peer, and she did turn out a haughty, headstrong creature. I own I did not like her after infancy was past, and I vexed her frequently by trying to bring down her arrogance. She never took an aversion to me, though. She had a wondrous constancy to old attachments. Even Heathcliff kept his hold on her affections unalterably, and young Linton, with all his superiority, found it difficult to make an equally deep impression. He was my late master, that is, his portrait over the fireplace. It used to hang on one side, and his wife's on the other, but hers has been removed, or else you might see something of what she was. Can you make that out? Mrs. Dean raised the candle, and I discerned a soft-featured face, exceedingly resembling the young lady at the Heights, but more pensive and amiable in expression. It formed a sweet picture. The long, light hair curled slightly on the temples, the eyes very large and serious, the figure almost too graceful. I did not marvel how Catherine Earnshaw could forget her first friend for such an individual. I marvelled much how he, with a mind to correspond with his person, could fancy my idea of Catherine Earnshaw. A very agreeable portrait, I observed to the housekeeper. Is it like? Yes, she answered, but he looked better when he was animated. That is, his everyday countenance. He wanted spirit in general. Catherine had kept up her acquaintance with the Lintons since her 5 weeks' residence among them, and as she had no temptation to show her rough side in their company, and had the sense to be ashamed of being rude where she experienced such invariable courtesy, she imposed unwittingly on the old lady and gentleman by her ingenious cordiality, gained the admiration of Isabella, and the heart and soul of her brother. Acquisitions that flattered her from the first, for she was full of ambition, and led her to adopt a double character without exactly intending to deceive anyone. In the place where she heard Heathcliff termed a vulgar young ruffian and worse than a brute, she took care not to act like him, but at home she had small inclination to practice politeness that would only be laughed at, and restrain an unruly nature when it would bring her neither credit nor praise. Mr. Edgar seldom mustered courage to visit Wuthering Heights openly. He had a terror of Earnshaw's reputation, and shrunk from encountering him. And yet he was always received with our best attempts at civility. The master himself avoided offending him, knowing why he came, and if he could not be gracious, kept out of the way. I rather think his appearance there was distasteful to Catherine. She was not artful, never played the croquet, and had evidently an objection to her two friends meeting at all, for when Heathcliff expressed contempt of Linton in his presence, she could not half coincide as she did in his absence. And when Linton evinced disgust and antipathy to Heathcliff, she dared not treat his sentiments with indifference, as if depreciation of her playmate were of scarcely any consequence to her. I've had many a laugh at her perplexities and untold troubles, which she vainly strove to hide from my mockery. That sounds ill-natured, but she was so proud it became really impossible to pity her distresses till she should be chastened into more humility. She did bring herself finally to confess and to confide in me. There was not a soul else that she might fashion into an adviser. Mr. Hindley had gone from home one afternoon, and Heathcliff presumed to give himself a holiday on the strength of it. He had reached the age of 16 then, I think, and without having bad features or being deficient in intellect, he contrived to convey an impression of inward and outward repulsiveness that his present aspect retains no traces of. In the first place, he had by that time lost the benefit of his early education. Continual hard work, begun soon and concluded late, had extinguished any curiosity he once possessed in pursuit of knowledge, and any love for books or learning. His childhood sense of superiority, instilled into him by the favours of old Mr. Earnshaw, was faded away. He struggled long to keep up an equality with Catherine in her studies, and yielded with poignant though silent regret, but he yielded completely, and there was no prevailing on him to take a step in the way of moving upward, when he found he must necessarily sink beneath his former level. Then personal appearance sympathized with mental deterioration. He acquired a slouching gait, an ignoble look. His naturally reserved disposition was exaggerated into an almost idiotic excess of unsociable moroseness, and he took grim pleasure, apparently, in exciting the aversion rather than the esteem of his few acquaintance. Catherine and he were constant companions, still at his seasons of respite from labour, but he had ceased to express his fondness for her in words, and recoiled with anger, suspicion from her girlish caresses, as if conscious there could be no gratification in lavishing such marks of affection on him. On the before-named occasion, he came into the house to announce his intention of doing nothing while I was assisting Miss Cathy to arrange her dress. She had not reckoned on his taking it into his head to be idle, and imagining she would have the whole place to herself. She managed by some means to inform Mr. Edgar of her brother's absence, and was then preparing to receive him. "Cathy, are you busy this afternoon?" asked Heathcliff. "Are you going anywhere?" "No, it is raining," she answered. "Why have you that silk frock on then?" he said. "Nobody come in here, I hope?" "Not that I know of," stammered Miss, "but you should be in the field now, Heathcliff. It is an hour past dinner time. I thought you were gone." Hindley does not often free us from his accursed presence. Observe the boy. I'll not work any more today. I'll stay with you. Join me. Join me for the next episode of Wuthering Heights as the relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff change. Join me for the next video of Wuthering Heights with me, Morel Benard. I'll see you then. Okay.